Jonathan Zeitlin. Together with Natili, I co-chair this monthly online seminar of the Standing Group on the European Union of the ECPR. You probably already know that because you managed to find your way to logging in. And we're very happy today to have a paper by Marcello and Natili, and Stefano Ronchi on the politics of European minimum wage, overcoming ideological, territorial, and institutional conflicts in the EU multi-level arena. And I will very briefly introduce them. So Stefano is a postdoctoral researcher in the ERC project known as SOLID at the Department of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Milan. And maybe you can also remind us what SOLID stands for. His research interests include comparative welfare state analysis, social inequalities, and the politics of European integration. And he's published in a distinguished set of what we could call the usual suspect journals. And Marcello is assistant professor of political science at the Department of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Milan. His interests are in the field of comparative welfare states, and they include labor and social inclusion policies, federalism, redistribution, and European social governance. And he published in 2019 a book on the politics of minimum income, explaining path, departure, and policy reversals in the age of austerity with Palgrave Macmillan. He's published also in a wide range of social and social policy journals. And I'm also very happy to welcome Amandine Crespy, who is our discussant. She's associate professor of political science and European studies at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, the ULB. She is a researcher at the Centre d'études de la vie politique, CEVIPOL, and the Institut d'études européennes there, where she currently leads a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence called EU Qualis, dealing with inequalities in the EU. And again, she's published widely in different journals, and she focuses on economic governance, social policy in the EU, and on the role of ideas, discourse, and conflict. She's published a number of important books, and I'll just mention the most recent one, The European Social Question, Tackling Key Controversies, published last year by Agenda and building on a previous version in French. So the welcome everybody. The format is that the paper givers will have about half an hour to 40 minutes to present. I think from what they've said, it'll be closer to 30 minutes. And Amandine as discussant will have 10 minutes. Then perhaps I and maybe Natili might also comment or ask some questions. We'll give the paper givers a quick chance to respond, and then we will open up to Q&A to you, the audience, and you will have the opportunity either to pose questions in the chat, which we can read out, or indeed preferably to take the floor yourselves, and then I'll ask you to introduce yourselves as we go. So Stefano and Marcello, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very nice introduction, and thank you all for the invite. We're very happy to have the opportunity to present today our work on the politics of the European Minimum Wage Directive. And as Jonathan rightly reminded us before, this is actually a small piece of wider work from the ERC SOLID, wider work that our team at the University of Milan, which comprises the principal investigator is Maurizio Ferrera, And then we have our colleagues Anna Kiriasi, that's actually connected here. Thank you, Anna. And Joan Miro Artigas, that together with Marcello and myself are contributing to the writing of a book that we are, pardon for the background noise, that we are writing for Routledge on what we decided to call the social crisis of Europe. And as you may guess, the minimum wage, the politics of the EU minimum wage is part of this broader framework. So we are going to split the presentation in two parts. I'm going to briefly introduce the background and then present some data. And then Marcello will take over and he will explain, go more in depth, basically explain details from the process tracing qualitative part of our research, and then go on with the conclusions and hopefully some food for thoughts for the Q&A time as well. So in a nutshell, since I assume you are all expert of social Europe and social policies in general. So as we all know, there's a variety of very different minimum wage setting systems in the European Union, in EU countries. Some member states are endowed with statutory minimum wages. In some other countries instead, most typically, that's the ideal typical end of the continuum, so to speak. In Nordic countries, this is all set through collective agreements, whereby the state does not play a role at all, almost in wage setting. There are, however, also hybrid models, most notably Germany, since the introduction of the national statutory minimum wage in 2015, as well as other countries which joined this cluster. As Guglielmo Meardi himself, we met him in Brescia at the conference of the Italian Society of Economic Sociology. We were in the same panel, reminded us no country which introduced a statutory minimum wage put the backtrack. So once countries introduced that, these were all left in place. The second aspect, which is important to define the background, especially from a political science perspective, is that traditionally, and with traditionally I mean at least until 5 to 10 years ago at most, even the usual suspect in a way of in terms of social politics, that is left-wing leaning actors, unions in particular, have been skeptic towards minimum wages, both at home, so in their own countries, and especially so at the European Union level. And that's these two factors basically explain the low relevance of the European Union in matters regarding the coordination of minimum wage policy at the supranational level. Moreover, in the decade of the sovereign debt crisis, the euro crisis, and more specifically between 2008 and 2018-19, labor market deregulation, in-work poverty, increasing in-work poverty, and the decreasing relevance of collective bargaining in general carried the days. Indeed, the Commission, the EU itself, was more on the side of internal devaluation rather than on catering for the adequacy of minimum wages. We can see that rather easily in outcome by looking at some Eurostat data on outcome. The most obvious one is in-work poverty, which I already cited before. And this graph simply shows how, with the only exception of Northern European countries, in all other member state clusters, in-work poverty increased from the early 2000 until now, until a couple of years ago. Interestingly, that negative trend regarded not only the usual suspects, meaning peripheral countries, Southern European countries, but also so-called core countries, including Germany, Austria, Belgium, but also France. In terms of institutions, minimum wages, basically in virtually no country endowed with statutory minimum wages, the latter is adequate in respect to the mostly used, and with mostly I refer to, for example, ILO standards. So mostly used referred to thresholds of adequacy that are the 50% of average national wages, gross wages, and the 60% of median national wages. In virtually no countries, with some partial exceptions, especially in France, statutory minimum wages are adequate, so above these limits. Most important, as scholars, especially coming from industrial relations background, know very well, when we look beyond statutory minimum wages, so at union density, the coverage of collective bargaining, what we have witnessed from 2000 and from the 90s actually on is a decrease in importance of union density, so the capability of unions to represent workers and labor in general, and of collective bargaining to cover a wide number of workers. Of course, there are exceptions. Italy is somehow one of them, but also Northern European countries. If it is true that the European Union until 2018, as I said before, was avoiding to step politically and policy-wise to step into the field of minimum wage coordination. The music to change with the von der Leyen Commission, namely in October 2020, so a bit more than 2 years ago, von der Leyen launched a proposal of a minimum wage directive that after exactly 2 years, so in October 2022, just 3-4 months ago, was finally adopted. There are 3 main points of the minimum wage directive, which I try to summarize in the following. So, first of all, the directive aims to promote procedures for setting and updating effective minimum wages only in countries in which there's already such a scheme, so statutory minimum wage set by law. And the 2 thresholds, which I mentioned before, are the one softly, so to speak, recommended by the directive itself. Second, but not less important, the directive wants to strengthen collective bargaining in a rather assertive way, meaning that the threshold, the objective which is indicated is 80% of collective bargaining coverage, which is comparatively high, especially if you look at this column. I mean, these are data from some 2-3 years ago, but in the large majority of EU countries, the situation is the real world situation is far below this generous 80% threshold. Third, the directive wants also to establish, does establish mechanism for monitoring the coverage and adequacy of minimum wages. Relative to 10-15 years ago, what we, but not only us, actually also other authors identified is a paradigmatic change in the European Union stance vis-a-vis minimum wage policies, specifically in highly contentious policy fields. Why so? Because as I mentioned in the introductory slides, there are deep-rooted territorial, institutional, and political ideological conflicts behind these specific social and labor policy domains. Thus, we pose the following guiding research question. First, what conflicts, again, territorial, institutional, as well as political, shaped the debate around the European Minimum Wage Directive? Second, how was it possible to overcome these conflicts so that the directive finally made it to the policy agenda of the Commission and was then a few months ago adopted by the European Union? We put the main focus on actors' coalitions, actors intended as both member states and their political leaders, and party groups and social partners. So we look at both the European Commission as a EU institutional actors, but especially at political actors, party groups in the European Parliament and in the member states, governments and party politics. And we also focus on the political backlash provoked by the launch of the directive, especially in Northern Europe. And I'll give you a bit more detail in the following. We mix two methods. First, and I'll show you some detail, systematic content analysis of news media data, basically of information gathered from quality newspaper articles on minimum wage and the European Union. Second, we conducted process tracing by use of, desk research, as we usually say, as well as 14 interviews with relevant actors. We rely on this analytical framework that's not completely new. Actually, we borrowed extensively from Maurizio Ferreira's work, Yesul and Madama, as well as Patrick Bezan and Francesco Corti's work. They also distinguish between 3-4 lines of conflict, informing crucially the politics, more generally speaking, of social Europe. The ideological one, pitting against each other those in favor of market making, market solution, and those in favor of social justice, social policy in general. Territorial divides, typically running from east, new member states, to west, older core member states of the European Union. Integration demarcation divide, to put it alla Triesi and his colleagues. So those a priori battling for national sovereignty against the Europeanists, and I highlighted this third layer because that's a novelty Marcello and I tried to introduce, the institutional conflict. That is to say, those actors protecting national policy legacies, so the prerogative of national welfare state institutions and the national government, against those who are instead in favor or who shifted in favor of the EU intervention in social policy matters, of course, with reference to minimum wage setting policy in general. The quantitative part of the empirics starts, we looked at both the positions of the actors vis-a-vis the European minimum wage issue, the minimum wage issues in the European Union more in general, coded as in the slides, and we also coded the frames, that is to say, rhetorical justification given in the newspapers, so in the public debate by the relevant actors to justify their positions or opinions concerning minimum wage policy in the EU. As frames, we basically referred to our basic analytical hooks that are the 4 lines of conflict illustrated before. A few preliminary exploratory quantitative results. So these 2 graphs show you the positions taken by the actors, so negative, minus, ranging from -1, utterly negative, through 0, neutral, to +1, completely positive stance. So 3 most important aspects. First of all, we did find evidence of the usual, well-known, traditional labor capital divide. In fact, employers' organizations were by and large against the proposal, while trade unions were overall, with some exceptions, we'll comment, especially in the process racing part, overall in favor. In the European Parliament, interestingly, the left was in favor, while the opposition came from populist / Eurosceptic parties, but not really from center to center-right parties, which are here in correspondence to the 0 line, because the average was 0, a bit unfortunate for the graph, but quite relevant because they were internally divided, but overall they did not oppose. Instead, they were quite in favor at the end of the day, and this will be highlighted in a better way by the process racing part of the proposal. Then the very enemies, so to speak, of the proposal of the European Minimum Wage Directive were Northern European countries. I mean, and this was true for all actors from Northern Europe, be them left-wing inclined or from other ideological backgrounds. While by contrast, in Southern Europe, all observations we coded from the newspaper articles, so at least the evidence with regards to the media debate, all Southern European actors, regardless of their ideological inclination, were throughout the years coded in favor of the minimum wage directive proposal.
Stefano,
yes?
I just ask you to tell us very quickly which countries count as Northern Europe in this analysis.
Yeah, it's Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and this is it. Maybe Marcello can help me.
The Netherlands were included in the core.
Core, exactly. Yeah.
So it's really the Nordic countries.
Yeah, let's call them exactly.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Social democratic welfare states, put it otherwise. You're welcome. But it's arguably even more interesting to look more in depth at frames. So normative rhetoric justification put forward by actors in the news media. First of all, the most relevant frame, which relates on a theoretical level to the lines of conflict commented before, which emerged from our quantitative analysis, was what we called institutional conflict. So social Europe versus national welfare prerogatives, which took almost 40% of the news media observation we then coded. And if taken together because we also coded overlaps, so these are not mutually exclusive categories, but we also took into account overlaps between, for example, as in line 3, the state market conflict and the social Europe national welfare conflict. If taken together, the first and the third line, basically also half, 50% of the observation concerned also the institutional conflict, while the ideological state market, to be sure, conflict was also relevant, almost 25%, and the others, including the territorial one and the integration demarcation dimensions, were far less relevant, actually. When looking at differences between actors and member states, I mean political actors and member states group, we observed the following. First, the left, and Marcello will give you the reasons, more explanatory insight beneath that. the left was capable, going very fast, to subsume the territorial divides, especially under the hat of ideology, so normative political stances. And indeed, I mean, after the left, also centrist actors, for example, Macron in France, jumped on the bandwagon, but also some part of center to center right, CDU to be sure, actors from Germany, jumped on the bandwagon of European minimum wage, of the proposal. The very opposite, but also Eurosceptic parties in terms of pro-state intervention were on that side. If you look at the white bar here on the A left side graph, while the division, the profound ideological division is still highlighted for unions against employers. But more interestingly, while overall in terms of state against market, so market against state intervention, so visible, invisible hand, all actors were in favor of state intervention. When it came especially, not only, but especially to the institutional conflict, Eastern as well as Northern European actors were against the directive because of, so along that precise conflict dimension specifically. Of course, Eastern actors, especially back in time, 5-6 years, when the debate was captured by the debate around the revision of the posted worker directives, were also against the issue of minimum wages due to some competitive advantage reason, somewhat misleadingly labeled by myself social dumping here. But the common denominator was their pro-national welfare prerogative stance. So that was the frame, the political frame that motivated especially the Nordic opposition specifically. And with this, I leave the floor to Marcello. I'll take care of shifting slides meanwhile.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stefano, and thank you very much for inviting us to present our work. Basically, as already mentioned by Stefano, we combine this analysis of news media with process tracing. The idea was that if the analysis of the news and conflict allowed us to give a rather static picture of the most relevant lines of conflict over the minimum wage directive, process tracing could allow to give a more dynamic account of conflict dynamics and how they actually were and how they interacted and when they were relevant in the different moment of the policy making process. And also how it was possible to overcome such deeply intertwined multidimensional lines of conflict. Also because process tracing could allow to look at behind the closed door negotiation, whereas our news media analysis could only look at the public phase, let's say, of the policy-making process. So we think that these two methods combined quite well and allowed us to give us both a more static, a more precise and systematic analysis of the conflict structure, while at the same time also providing with a more dynamic account, allowing us to understand how in the policy-making process different conflict dimension interacted, and how it was possible to solve such a deeply entangled issue. So when in Europe actually we start the first proposal of a European minimum wage directive emerged, or at least the first proposal on a European minimum wage framework started to emerge actually just after the Eastern enlargement in the early 2000s. There were some proposal to actually a greater role of the European Union in the setting of minimum wages, coming both from academic and some political actors, especially from the French socialists. But these proposals were not really effective and did not reach a larger audience. Also because there were, as Stefano already mentioned, there were strong conflict also within the European left, among trade unions, with actually there were division among left-wing actors, with actually Nordic, German, and Italian unions defending their national model. So in all the countries where minimum wage were established through collective bargaining, actually trade unions and left-wing actors were quite skeptic towards a greater role of the European Union in defining, and of the state more general in defining minimum wage. Such proposal re-emerged also quite timidly in reason of this deeply entangled division within the left, also in the aftermath of the Euro crisis, basically. But they didn't have a lot of success also in this moment, both because of this division within the left, and also because we know that the European Commission was not really, the European Commission led by Barroso was not really supportive of, let's call it a social initiative. So basically the institutional conflict dividing the left front plus a conservative commission prevented this proposal from gaining momentum. Our the first moment that actually constituted the path breaking to some extent, or allowed institutional change at the end, was actually the introduction of a minimum wage reform in Germany. So something that has nothing to do with the European policy making. And we actually, I noted that Deborah Mambet is here. We learned a lot from her regarding how the politics of the minimum wage reform in Germany. And what we noticed actually that this was a clearly shift in the German.
All right, can I ask all participants who are not presenting to mute their, like Graham Finlay, can you please mute your microphone because we can hear you in the background. Okay, so if everybody other than Marcello can mute, then we can go back to the presentation. Marcello? Okay.
So we noted this kind of event, the introduction of a minimum wage reform in Germany, constituted a very crucial moment also at the European level, let's say, because it allowed the internal division to actually attenuate, and the European minimum wage become immediately afterwards, you can really see how these two things were closely intertwined, become one of the key electoral proposal of the Party of European Socialists against European Union austerity. And also this was supported also, especially we notice also that within we noticed a change of attitude towards this initiative among the German trade unions. Then there was a second phase opened with the Juncker Commission that gave actually a new impetus to the European Union social agenda. There was the launch of the European Pillar of Social Rights. Notwithstanding, nothing much happened in terms of specific commitment on new wage coordination, also because the main focus was on the Posting Workers Directive, which was here I noticed that Anna Kyriazi explained us how it was possible actually to overcome also in that regard a deeply entangled conflict, and how it was possible to reach a consensus, but the focus of the Commission was there. And then we find out that the two specific events that are not linked to European Union policy making contributed to make this proposal much more relevant than in the past. And these are related to French and German national election. In France, we know that Macron, in order also to win the election in France, specified that it was very important to introduce Euro social initiative. Actually combine this kind of agenda, as Daniel Clegg emphasized, of liberalizing reform at the national level, combined with socially oriented reform at the supranational level, and distressed reform of at the supranational level, also supporting a European minimum wage directive. And what is even more interesting, in Germany, again, national action, at the beginning, Merkel wanted to form a coalition with, I mean, at the end, the SPD refused to enter in a coalition with the CDU. But at the end, Merkel was able, let's say, I'm simplifying, to reach an agreement the SPD. But in order to do so, she had said they were to comply and to agree on developing a framework for European minimum wage regulation. This was it is kind of interesting from our side, the fact that regulation over the negotiation to form in order to form a national government actually were also about European level policy decision, and actually and the SPD in that occasion was able to actually convince the Merkel to actually develop a framework for minimum wage regulation at the European level. And we have also evidence that in this period there were mobilization at the national level, again, for example, the German trade union, again, in support of a supranational regulation. And what we find interesting here is that actors began to mobilize for the European minimum wage regulation, not only on equity grounds, but for the promotion of a EU social policy intervention that actually could protect a national social model. So reframing what we call the institutional conflict, but actually so that the institutional conflict became somehow positive and somehow could allow for the introduction of the European minimum wage. Under this condition, the European minimum wage became a key electoral proposal of leftist actor in the European Parliament. Also because, I mean, with the German and the French supporting this initiative, and with actually also quite interesting, this kind of electoral proposal become very relevant when von der Leyen had to secure the support of the leftist actor in the European Parliament in order to get to become commissioner. And in order to do so, she promised one of the things that she put very high on her agenda was precisely the introduction of a European minimum wage. Once this proposal entered into the political agenda, it became very contentious. We observed the strong, very firm opposition of northern countries. In some cases, we had actually ministry threatening to get out of the European Union, exit. There was threat of Denmark exiting from the European Union, precisely because this was something that was strongly opposed by the Nordic countries, and this has not and we noticed that all the actors from, as Stefano already mentioned, from the right to the left, business actor, trade unions in Nordic countries were strongly against this initiative. The second line of conflict, the second actor opposing this initiative was Business Europe, which was very critical of the initiative. But perhaps more interestingly, we observe also the strong support from the European Trade Union Confederation, also testifying how leftist actors were able to overcome territorial conflict despite the opposition of Nordic countries. Once the proposal was launched, we observed very different dynamics in the Council and in the European Parliament. Actually, in the European Parliament welcomed the proposal, proposed more ambitious amendment, and the only line of opposition was the demarcationist one, with Identity and Democracy and the European Conservative and the ECR opposing the initiative, the only two-party group. In the Council, the dynamic were more conflictual. Actually, both Nordic and some Eastern government, precisely the Polish government and the Hungarian government, opposed the initiative. But there was a very strong coalition again of southern countries and core countries supporting the initiative and being at the end able to find an agreement, even though some of the proposal had to be watered down, especially in terms of the generosity and of the minimum wage level. At the end, so it was possible to reach an agreement precisely because there was this kind of strong coalition between core and Southern European countries. Going to the conclusion, what are our main conclusions? First of all, I did not emphasize this in this reconstruction, but the erosion of national social protection institution was actually key. We observed Stefano started his presentation emphasizing how both collective agreement and statutory minimum wage ability to prevent poverty among the workforce decline, and this is actually our starting point to some extent. This is one of the key trigger, but actually not sufficient. Our second key finding it is that, yes, of course, institutional conflict, as highlighted by much of the literature, can break the expansion of a social Europe. But at the same time, we find out that in some countries, and not only Germany and France, but also Italy, and to some extent also in Austria, this conflict was actually resolved. And there is this kind of new argument emerging. It's not completely new argument, but actually the fact that Germany actually agreed to this argument is a key novelty. And this argument is that actually the promotion of EU regulation began to be considered key to strengthen national social institutions. And this is a novelty in social Europe, at least in our reading. Third, also the fact that Euro electoral politics become relevant. This is not so much frequently emphasized in the literature on social Europe, but we find out that that there was a fundamental impetus of the European left, and that this kind of dynamic were quite important in order to understand how this proposal entered into the agenda of the von der Leyen Commission. Finally, although it was not so much captured in the news media analysis for different reasons, we find the integration demarcation conflict was indeed relevant. And we find also, and this is also, we did not expect that, their position from the East is much more rooted in this kind of demarcationist political mood rather than based on competitive advantage or institutional reasons. So the line of conflict between East and West was more relevant in terms of the West promoting anti-social, using at least anti-social dumping frame rather than a reason for opposing this initiative by Eastern countries. And finally, and this is more relevant in general also for our project, the SOLID project actually, one of the key, we want to study European integration from a state building perspective, and we found out that actually both national and EU electoral and coalitional dynamics are deeply intertwined, and so this kind of, it doesn't make we think that it doesn't make a lot of sense to focus on just one of them, because they're clearly percolated into one into the others. And I'm sorry if I took too much time, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot. That was great. So if you can stop sharing your screen, then we go over to Amandine as the discussant. So Amandine, the floor is yours.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very, very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to take part in this seminar series and to discuss this paper in particular. I read it with really a great interest. It's also a topic that I'm particularly interested in. Here at ULB, I have a simulation course on the ordinary legislative procedure, and every year we pick a different legislative proposal from the EU, and last year was this particular text. Well, overall, I would say this is a very nice paper. I really enjoyed it, and I think it's very comprehensive. It gives a very broad but also detailed overview and very nice insights about this particular proposal and the whole policy process. And also there's nothing really in the paper that I would disagree with. And I especially like her conclusions. So I think they're really strong. The idea that, you know, in spite of institutional constraints that, you know, at the end of the day, political processes and the politics that surround a particular proposal are more important, or, you know, that the European political game is not locked into institutional constraints, I think is both very true, but also strong in this particular case. Also, the conclusion about the multi-level dynamics. I think quite clearly also, and I'll come back to this, but we see here that more than a top-down process, it's really much about also bottom-up process. Perhaps we could go as far as to argue that, you know, if Germany had not itself introduced a minimum wage, all this would never have happened. So this is a strong claim to make, but I think there are good grounds to make it, and that your paper also in a way shows this empirically. So this is a great paper. This being said, of course, I will take my role as a discussant very seriously and try to challenge you on some points, and not so much on the conclusions then on all the steps and how you construct your demonstration to arrive at those particular conclusions. So first of all, on the methods, a difficulty for me here is that I do not know the PPA methodology in detail. You explain it just a little bit in the paper. Yet I was a little bit skeptical of it for a series of reasons. First of all, I was a bit disturbed by the fact that this particular methodology is measuring claims and actions at the same time, merging two methods that were previously known. This, you know, kind of protest action where you really try to reconstruct facts through the media. And on the other hand, the claims analysis, which focuses on discourse. And for me, identifying or analyzing actions and facts on one hand and claims and discourse on the other hand are two different things. And I really wonder what it is. They're two different things. They also have different theoretical underpinnings, I find, and different methodological implications. So it is complicated to understand what it is that is being measured, especially because this is through the media. So either you use the media to reconstruct facts, and you know that you have a possible bias here, or you use the media to reconstruct, you know, actors' discourses, but then you really have to look for direct quotations or interviews or longer, you know, texts in the press that you know are not the result of editorial work. So I think there's a few difficulties here. And then secondly, also, it's a little bit difficult to understand what the figures in your tables actually mean with regard to those actions and claims. So, for instance, you have this figure where you have several actors, and we see, you know, the European Commission ranging 0.51 positively in favor of regulating minimum wages, but then you wonder, okay, but the Commission puts forward the proposals, so it has to be in favor. So why only, you know, 0.5 and not, you know, 1? So that's a little bit strange. So then I think here you have a problem in terms of measuring the content and direction of the claims, and measuring the salience of what is being reported about what actors do or claim in the press. But again, of course, you know a lot better about the PPA method you employ than I do here. So I'm interested in hearing your answers, of course, on this. Then on the framework and those conflict lines that you analyze, So of course, at first sight, they all seem to be very relevant and even obvious. But then I think there's two difficulties with this again, perhaps the first one being that, I mean, if you know a little bit as you do about social policy, it's quite clear that they all will be relevant to a certain extent. So it's a very broad framework to start with, right? So that's one aspect. And then the second aspect is about how you frame and name those lines of conflict, right? For instance, you talk about the ideological conflict, and I think that this term is misleading. I think what you're actually talking about here is the left-right cleavage, right? Now, this cleavage could be interpreted as being ideological, but it could also be interpreted as being material, opposing, you know, workers' interests and capital's interests. So I think there's something to be careful here. Also, you know, the territorial and perhaps to a greater extent what you called the demarcation versus integration conflict, and the institutional as well. I mean, you know, it's not because you have an institutional misfit that this automatically leads actors to be against an EU proposal. You have obviously, you know, some political work being conducted here. Also, to a very large extent, this demarcation, integration conflict is present in all the member states to an extent. And here again, it can also be very ideological on how, you know, a certain proposal is being, you know, interpreted as going against, you know, the national interest, let's put it this way, or the interest of the national people. So I think that to a certain extent, all those conflicts are ideological because it depends on how a given government is interpreting, you know, or is anticipating the effects of a given EU proposal on the situation of the country. And of course, as we know, in reality, the institutional and political aspects are intertwined. So I'm wondering whether at the end of the day, those conflict lines are not in fact boiling to essentially two dimensions that are those that many scholars work with, namely the left-right axis on one hand and the EU versus national on the other hand. So I guess my broader argument here for the paper is that it would probably be even more compelling if you started from a sharper theoretical angle rather than from this broad, you know, picture of lines of conflict that we already know in the field of social policy. And I think that your conclusions, in fact, point a lot more to, you know, this institutional versus politics aspect, showing the importance of politics. As I said, there's perhaps also a more specific argument to be made about the pivotal role of Germany and German actors, starting with the unions, by the way, not necessarily with political parties, but starting with the DGB. That's where it all started. When the DGB started to campaign for the introduction of a statutory minimum wage in Germany itself, it also started to change its position with regard to a European proposal there. And then finally, perhaps also the sharpening of the paper would call to distinguish a little bit more between how and why the issue was put on the agenda on one hand, and how and why the proposal was successful at the decision-making stage on the other hand, because also those are two different stages of the policy process. So yeah, these are my comments, and thanks again for the very interesting paper.
Thank you, Amandine. Let me, before we give you a chance to respond, Marcello and Stefano, make a few comments and ask a question of my own, and then we'll also open up afterwards to the audience. So you in the audience, please start to formulate the questions you would like to ask. I also think it's a very nice paper. So one observation, one dimension, and I would not claim that it is a fundamental dimension, but I think it's nonetheless a significant one, is internal change in the thinking of the European Commission prior to the coming of the von der Leyen Commission, and not only change taking place in the, let's say, the historic supporter of social Europe, that is DG Employment and Social Affairs, but also inside DG ECFIN. And it's interesting that already in 2013, DG ECFIN they launched a kind of fellowship program in which they brought in people who would not typically have been supporters of a classic liberal economic line to question aspects of their policy. And Jelle Visser, for example, in 2013 published a paper for them on wage bargaining institutions and stressing the benefits of collective bargaining coverage and the minimum wage. They had Vivian Schmidt on legitimacy. They brought Frank van den Broeke in on what the institutional requirements for a well-functioning monetary union would be. He very much emphasized coordination of wage bargaining as a positive. It's also true that a classic recommendation from the Commission in running through this period in the country-specific recommendations is to link wages more with productivity. And originally, that led to questioning the level of the minimum wage in some countries and pushing for de-indexation and decentralization of wage bargaining. But gradually, there was more and more emphasis that wages in the countries who were running a surplus, such as on their trade balances and fiscal surpluses, such as Germany and the Netherlands, should raise wages. So there was a gradual, I think, change in the perspective, even among the economic policy DG within the Commission, and that meant that when the political impetus came forward to do something about the minimum wage and to say things about this in the European Pillar of Social Rights, you did not have any longer a strong opposition from within the Commission to this from, let's say, what have historically been called the economically oriented actors. So I think that's one point I would like to stress. The second point I would like to stress is that this issue of the Nordic countries with their inclusive social democratic welfare states trying to defend their autonomy against the expansion of social Europe is a very long-standing theme. It goes back at least to the point where Finland and Sweden joined the EU in the 1990s. And if you look at the Convention on the Future of Europe, which preceded the draft constitutional treaty, it had in the end a social Europe working group where these issues were very explicitly debated. And what you found was a kind of unholy alliance between employers and groups who were opposed to more intervention in the labor market, on the one hand, with the Nordic countries, including the trade unions, wanting to defend their own institutions, including free collective bargaining, against an expansion of the statutory powers of the union. So this is a moment when treaty amendment was on the table, and they blocked it. And so that leads to my third question, which is, it is in the end, I think Amandine is right, and you also emphasizes that the shift in Germany's position, was quite crucial, but still, it is striking, in some ways surprising, that both the ETUC and the EU more generally was willing to override what were considered to be these really existential concerns of the Nordic countries and the Nordic trade unions within the ETUC and within the political process, also in the socialists and Democrats in the parliament. So my question would be for you, how do you explain the fact that the other countries, other trade unions, were prepared to really override the position of the Nordics on this issue, which, as you say, particularly for Denmark, was seen as an existential issue. It's interesting that Sweden did not, in the end, it didn't vote against the proposal in the council. So anyway, I'll let you respond to Amandine's point and my point. Natili, did you want to come in at all at this stage?
Thank you very much for the many comments. How do we do, Marcello? Would you like to go first, or I go ahead?
As you prefer. I can go first, and
yeah, that would be my preference for the time being. But thank you very much for the many comments and insights. I'll feel possible gaps after Marcello. Thanks.
Yes, of course. Well, then I will start with the last comments made by Jonathan, by at least two of them, and then I will go more to the point. First of all, thank you very much. They were all great points. I don't know if I will be able to answer all of them. They were really, really precise, and I can say, and that's not always the case. They make all a lot of sense. First of all, regarding how it was able to override existential, how both the ETUC and the European Union institution more in general were able to override existential criticism of the Nordic. My take on this very important question is that they were able to isolate the Nordic countries, and they were able. Once you have once you have France, Germany, Southern European countries, and also many Eastern European countries, and it become only a Nordic issue, let's say. Then, you can have when 85% of the trade unions within the European Trade Union Federation agrees with this proposal, and when also, the European Commission started to actually to give a lot of concession in terms of policy proposal and the drafting of the proposal to the Nordic, so that it was clear that it is not so much, the problem is not so much what it is in the directive, because this does not really challenge the Nordic model, but the point it is the eventual intrusion in these matters of the European Union constitute a problem per se for the Nordic. It's not a matter of what it is in the directive. It is precisely the fact that the European Union is intervening in these matters, and in the future, this might constitute a problem. I think that this is the key issue for the Nordic. But once they were isolated, then it was possible. Once you were able to overcome the other territorial conflict, I think that then I mean the Nordic were put, let's say, were in a sort of in an angle, and then it was a more, and then it was also because it became very important for certain countries, the introduction of this initiative. And this is at least this is how I see the dynamics, this kind of territorial dynamics. In terms of the additional change of the Commission, I totally agree. I mean, it was important. It is, I think, our take on it. This is a part of the story that, to some extent, has been already told. The shift, let's say the entrepreneurial role of the Commission with the shift from the Barroso Commission to the Juncker Commission, it's something that the literature has already emphasized, and we agree with that. We also want to point that without other dynamics, it would not have been enough, let's say. And you can see clearly, for example, also the pillar. It's clearly evident that there was a shift in the ideological there was an important ideational change on the side of the Commission, but without some kind of political dynamics at the national level, that in our reading it would not have been necessary in order to go through to obtain a directive. So something which is going beyond the regulatory. I mean, this is something a soft law mechanism. And this is at least how, so we agree with you, but we think that our reading kind of allows to have a broader understanding of the political dynamics. We totally agree about the fact that the Nordic opposition towards EU intervention is nothing new. It's something that was there since the beginning. And in fact, we consider that the interesting part of the story is the fact that, as you said, at the end they were isolated, the Nordic, in this kind of political dynamics, and that's what we try to explain. Then, thank you very much, Amandine. I have to say, okay, on the methods, I understand your point. We try to put a lot in this paper. We have process tracing, we have frame analysis, and we have also claim analysis. We have also we use also descriptively, let's say, we use action in our PPA. At the same time, there is a distinction. Perhaps it is not so clear in the paper. We both code action, which is anything that it is related to the European minimum wage directive, whereas when we try to investigate frame, we only consider direct quotes from political actors. So this partially perhaps allows to respond to your concern, while at the same time I agree that there is a lot going on in the paper, and I also agree we are so interested to some extent in the dynamics that I agree with you that it's difficult to put both to try to explain the agenda setting and the factors that allow to solve conflict and so to arrive to the adoption of the initiative. At the same time, we hope that we are able to combine in order to have an integrated story. We think that we think that the two things are strongly interrelated, let's say, and they allow us. And this is also why I agree with you that I mean, why we focus, and with that, then I will leave the floor to Stefano. Why we focus on the lines of conflict, because this is what I mean. We want to capture the relevance of lines of conflict throughout all the policymaking process. We do not. There are some, I think, insight in that goes along what you were suggesting, to move to look at the conflict between the institutions and politics, but I don't know. We think that this idea of looking at how the different lines of conflict has some potential in order to understand the policy development concerning social Europe. Although we might refine them, I think that you point to a right weak spot when you say that ideological conflict perhaps it's not the best way to describe it. Also because the demarcationist conflict is at least as ideological, or if not more ideological than the left-right cleavage, and we may want to improve that. At the same time, I think I will still support that the 4 lines of conflict are different from one, analytically speaking, different one from the others, and they will, so that, for example, the demarcationist conflict is different from the institutional conflict, and at the same time it's true that the territorial conflict, the East-West, is something different. And so, I mean, I think that that this kind of analytical framework can allow us to have a clear understanding of why it is so difficult to make some step forward towards a more social European Union, while at the same time allowing us to solve our puzzle. So why it was possible to adopt basically this initiative. But I mean, I will think a little bit more regarding these comments, and Stefano, perhaps you can improve my answers. But thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I think Marcello, well done. I mean, you've replied to the bulk of comments in a substantive way. So just 2 minor points, perhaps. I mean, we do share the methodological remarks put forward by Amandine. I mean, and I don't want to behave as a defensive writer of a paper against the notorious reviewer number 2. I mean, these are very important points, and there are some shortcomings that are in a way intrinsic in news media analysis, and we risked even more by coding both actions and claims. But again, as Marcello said, the frame analysis is based on a subset of observations, that is claims. It's basically claim-making analysis informed by these analytical frameworks. That is what the basis on which we define the frames in the public speech, in the public discourse, in a way. And given that we share these concerns, we decided to go to mix 2 methods. And I myself trust more old school or hardcore, if you wish, process tracing, because that's the way through which we managed to get to the core of the process. Also, those links in the chain of policy process that were not apparent at all in the media, and that's why this after I don't know how many decades, this method stays so strong. So I hope that we at least manage partly to take out the best of both worlds. So descriptive quantitative coding work plus process tracing. On salience, it's true. I mean, the figures. Okay, I'm reading now the chat. Yes, we submitted that to a journal, and by now I'm afraid that the double-blindedness, given the Brescia CISEC conference and today, is as long gone because of Twitter and publicity. But we thought that the review process could have been faster. But my bad. I mean, yes, it's already under revision. We submitted the first round of revision. I'm not telling the journal, at least.
You don't need to worry about that. At least here we have the real intellectual work of the discussion, as opposed to the formalities of the peer review in the journal. Okay, so thank you. Let's bring in the audience. We already have a question in the chat from Vincenzo Maccarone, who says he's in a shared space, so he asked me to read it out. For other people who are interested, just put your hands up and I will call on you. So Vincenzo thanks to you for the very interesting presentation. And here's his question. Do you think that the fact that wage policy became a de facto shared competence throughout the Eurozone crisis with interventions through country-specific recommendations and memoranda of understandings made it harder for opponents of the directive to argue that the EU had no legal basis to intervene on minimum wages? And of course, you didn't mention this in your paper, at least I don't recall, but obviously it is very striking that the treaty, says that the EU has no role in wage setting and collective bargaining and the right to strike and these core elements of what were considered to be national industrial relations prerogatives, and yet, as Vincenzo points out, that in effect, nonetheless, both the memorandum of understanding and recommendations from the EU institutions, I guess they're ultimately from the Council, did give instructions of a more or less binding character, more in the case of the MOUs, less in the case of CSRs, around wage setting. So I think it's an interesting question. I don't know whether you found any evidence for that in the debates that you analyzed.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vincenzo. Great question, actually, and very interesting. Well, I can reply that way. I'm not sure. I think that the opponents actually made that argument that the EU had no legal basis. Actually, they made it quite forcefully. And what I can say, what I found interesting is that some trade unions in particular, and in some countries, actually, the mechanism is a bit different from the one that you explained. So the fact that the Commission intervened through country-specific recommendation in a country such as Italy, promoting collective bargaining decentralization, for example, actually was one of the facts that triggered the trade union support for the initiative. And it was one of the facts that that was one of the triggers for why Southern European countries, more in general, were so supportive of the initiative. So I don't know if what you actually, the mechanism you proposed was actually at play. It is possible. What I'm pretty sure that happened, it is that the fact that actually the intervention through collective, through country-specific recommendation and the memorandum of understanding actually made some countries and some trade union much more supportive of the directive. This I can tell, because we have evidence of that.
Yeah, I think that may be what he was getting at, but thanks. Okay, I see Edwin Hercock, who has a question. And Edwin, in addition to unmuting, can you also just briefly introduce yourself?
Thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Ned Hercock. I work at the Swedish Institute for European Policy Studies. And I'm just putting together a book about social Europe initiatives and the history of them and present and possibly future. So that guides my question. So it's interesting being in Sweden, where this paper was very good, I thought, and focused on conflict. But in Sweden, it's much more a situation of unanimous agreement that this is a bad thing from everyone from the trade unions, both the white collar and blue collar, to the right, I mean, the Social Democratic Party, the right and the far right, I mean, the right in terms of business, not necessarily moderate party. So actually the fact that Sweden is going to join the legal challenge to this directive is because of the intervention of the far right party. So that's interesting, I thought, in the context of your observation about populist right and right-wing populist parties. So my question is, just wonder if you guys have any observations about what you've discovered about the kind of process of conflict and the coalitions says about future initiatives in this vein. It feels like a moment at which they're sort of starting to bubble up. I know that the Belgian presidency of the Council of the European Union is interested in hearing ideas like this. And then I guess it's also the moment in the political cycle when people start to try to influence what's going to be either nodded to or made possible by the strategic guidelines, the European Council informing the political guidelines of the Commission and stuff. So it's quite an interesting moment to think about what people might need to do. And yeah, that's it. Sorry if that's a bit vague.
Do you want to come back on that? I mean, it's noteworthy. People probably will have seen in Social Europe Journal online that Frank van den Broeke gave a speech in which he came back to the issue of access to social protection, on which there was a recommendation linked to the Pillar of Social Rights, and where he feels very strongly there should have been a directive or even a regulation, but it's very clear that the reason why the Commission went for a recommendation is because there was too much opposition among member states to a legislative initiative in this area. So that might be indeed the next step. And then there's a similar issue which is not about investment patients, but it's about a guaranteed minimum income, where again you've had recommendations, and the issue is less like a legal one about what's possible under the treaties, and more one about what member states are prepared to support. But would you like to come back to that?
Yeah, I may try, and I'd like to try to link this last very relevant question with Vincenzo's one. So to just quickly complement what Marcello said, I mean, my short answer would be yes, we do think that what happened in the last decade influenced the here and now situation and politics of the European Minimum Wage Directive, especially in the social crisis book we are writing, we meaning Marcello, myself, Anna Criasi, and Joan Miro. We have a kind of umbrella hypothesis on the political compensation. So more social Europe as a kind of post-austerity backlash reaction, that is to give some, a la Paul Pearson, political compensations to the losers, member state, the poor, and so on, after 10 years of austerity. And this, I mean, once internal devaluation was part and parcel, I mean, through country-specific recommendations and so on, when an increasing number of factors shifted to the other side, meaning, okay, stop, we need to do something on the opposite direction, so bolstering incomes, minimum wages, the social in the EU, in a way, that became relevant. So politics mattered, and that's also to partly maybe respond to Edwin. It's very hard to foresee what will happen for other Eurosocial initiatives, but I mean, in this case may be useful because it shows that, I mean, politics, and more specifically in a way, as Amandine flagged before, bottom-up national politics mattered a lot also for EU social politics, and this happened when core member states, first of all Germany, but also France, Spain, Belgium, and so on, all agreed on the importance of doing something in a strong way, read not recommendation, but namely a directive regarding minimum wages, both because of national dynamics, erosive dynamics, so the erosion of the power of unions and collective bargaining. I mean, Deborah Mabbet is here in the audience, and her paper was incredibly useful for us to trace back the politics of the German minimum wage and find linkages with the EU situation and politics of the European minimum wage. And then the contingence of the need on the EU side, also EU institutions, to be a bit more responsive, a la Chris Rao, but I don't want to embark in that debate, in contrast to what had been done 10 years before. So yes, we do have a say also in wage setting issues, but we need to shift gear, to change track. Thank you very much, Edwin, for the insight you gave us on the far right and legal action in Sweden. We have to dig deeper in that, and it's quite hard for us. But still, I mean, on my politics matters, national politics matters point, that's crucial when national politics in very much relevant member states matters, and this may be the final point. A social directive is possible, likely at least, when an issue is not so much politically relevant and not so important. Member states capitalize politically on that. A recommendation could be the outcome. Think of the minimum income recommendation. That's also very recent. That was a watered down proposal and initiative backed by different political importance and conditions, also in crucial member states. But that's speculation, I see, but we try.
Yeah. Well, listen, I mean, I think we could go on with the discussion, but it's now 5:30. It's a very, lively paper. I think we should thank the speakers and Amandine as the discussant. And I want just to remind that we will have our next seminar on the 16th of March. Sarah Wolf from Queen Mary University of London, who's also a member of the steering committee of the SGEU, will present a paper on coordinating the green digital pass at EU level and in France, lessons for the concept of civic duty in Europe. And, we look forward to seeing some of you there. So thanks again, and have a good evening, everybody.